Hello. In this video, I'm going to go through a few problems in practice problem set 115, in which we are classifying passages according to whether or not they contain arguments. I'm not going to try to go through the whole practice problem set. That would take too long for a video that I would expect any of you would watch. Before we start looking at any of these problems, though, let's quickly review the definition of argument. An argument is a set of statements where some, known as the premise or premises, are intended to be reasons to believe another statement, which is known as the conclusion. An argument, in other words, consists of a premise or premises plus a conclusion. So you've got to have at least two statements to have an argument. They might not be in separate sentences, that's neither here nor there, but you have to have at least two statements. Well, that does not mean that any two statements put together count as an argument. No, the statements have to have a particular relationship to each other. It has to be the case that one or more are intended to be reasons for believing another. Otherwise, whatever might be going on is not argumentation. I'm just going to pick a few problems in 115 that I think may illustrate some important points for you, or some points that are necessary for you to remember. Let me start with number 4, in which Holly Woodlawn said, "Life can be unpredictable, and so are husbands." We do have two statements here, and one begins with the word "so," which we know is a common conclusion introducer. However, we also know that the word "so" has many other meanings. Notice here, we could rewrite her second sentence in, here are a couple of ways to do it. And husbands are too. And husbands are also. And husbands are in addition. And husbands are as well. None of those words or phrases that I substituted for the word "so," although I put them at the end of the sentence, is a conclusion introducer. And neither of her statements are intended as a reason to believe the other. So here we do not have an argument. Let me turn now to number 6, which reads as follows. If you are allergic to birch or alder trees, you might react to celery, apples, or cherries. Grass allergies? Then tomatoes, potatoes, or peaches may bother you. Here we have two if-then statements, two conditional statements. The if-then structure of the second one might not be 100% clear to you, so let me make that explicit. If you have grass allergies, then tomatoes, potatoes, or peaches may bother you. Now, we know that an if-then statement by itself is not an argument. We also know that an if-then statement could be a conclusion of an argument, or it could be a premise in an argument. However, here, notice that neither of these if-then statements is intended as a reason to believe the other, and neither is intended to support anything else, and neither is supported by anything here. So we simply have two if-then statements that are not an argument. Let me turn now to number 8, a famous quote from Winston Churchill. "A nation without a conscience is a nation without a soul. A nation without a soul is a nation that cannot live." Here we have two statements, and neither one is intended as a reason to believe the other. However, we are looking at an argument with an unstated conclusion. And let me explain how I can recognize this. Remember when we were looking at arguments with unstated conclusions a little earlier on in Chapter 1, we looked at several commonly used argument patterns. One went as follows. A is B, B is C, therefore A is C. Notice that the two statements that Churchill has made fit A is B, B is C. He said, "A nation without a conscience is a nation without a soul. A nation without a soul is a nation that cannot live." Now, if we take those two together, we know that the intended conclusion from two statements with those patterns, the intended conclusion would have the pattern A is C. Putting that into words, picking up on the content from this Churchill quote, his unstated conclusion is the following. A nation without a conscience is a nation that cannot live. Now, I will remark that for me to recognize this as an argument, I had to have some familiarity with those commonly used argument patterns. Let me turn now to number 11. This says, heredity versus environment, nature versus nurture. The argument over what best explains intelligence has been going strong for more than a century. Well, we're told here about a controversy or a debate that's been going strong for more than a century. It's a debate or argument about what best explains intelligence. We are given very, very brief terms, not even really descriptions, of the two main positions in that debate, heredity and nature on one hand versus environment or nurture on the other hand. We're given no reason for believing either side of that debate. In other words, we're given no reason for believing anything here. In other words, there is no argument here. Now, I want to contrast 13 with 11, in which Barack Obama wrote the following. As the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were being debated, there were those who argued that government should not interject itself into civil society, that no law could force white people to associate with blacks. Upon hearing these arguments, Dr. King replied, "It may be true that the law can not make a man love me, but it can keep him from lynching me, and I think that's pretty important also." Like in 11, we're being told about a debate or an argument or a controversy. In 13, the controversy was whether or not the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65 should be passed as federal legislation. Very shortly into the passage, President Obama describes some reasons that opponents of those bills gave to support their opposition to those bills, reasons why the bills shouldn't be passed. And then after that, he tells us how Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. replied to those arguments. And Dr. King's reply is itself an argument for the opposite side of the debate. In other words, Dr. King was giving a reason for believing that those bills should be passed. So in 11, there was a debate that we were told about, but no reasons were given for believing either position in the debate. In the debate. In 13, we're being told about a debate, and reasons are being presented for believing each position in the debate. 13, in fact, contains two arguments, not just one. 14, I'll read to you. It says, U.S. culture is a product of the whole world, not just Anglos. If you've ever flown a kite, barbecued, surfed, participated in martial arts, bounced a rubber ball, chewed gum, eaten a chocolate bar, used a compass, witnessed a fireworks display, visited a library, smoked a cigarette, enjoyed a chili pepper, or drunk tea or coffee, then you've done things originally from Africa, South and East Asia, the Middle East, the Pacific Islands, and Native America. The second sentence is a very long if-then sentence. And there are no introducers used to indicate that that is a premise or a conclusion. However, notice that what that if-then sentence does is describe an awful lot of activities that are fairly common parts of U.S. culture, and then identifies them as having non-Anglo origins. So that tells us that second sentence is intended as a reason to believe that U.S. culture is a product of the whole world, not just Anglos. We do have an argument here. The second sentence is the premise. The first sentence is the conclusion. I'm going to go down to 16 now, which reads as follows. The sociologist Thad Williamson, a longtime admirer of the Carolina basketball program, tells a story about how men's basketball team advisor Burgess McSwain stayed on top of her charges even when they returned to finish their degrees after going pro early, as in the case of Michael Jordan. She'd heard that Jordan, already an NBA star and back in town for summer school, was playing golf when he should have been studying. She drove to Finley Golf Course, to the tee where Jordan was preparing to swing, rolled down her car window and told the player in no uncertain terms to get his ass into the car. He obliged. Well, we've got a fair number of words here, but we are simply being told a story. A true story. This is not fiction, but it's a story all the same. And within this story, no reasons are given to believe anything, so there is no argument in this passage. In a minute, or a couple minutes, I will compare and contrast 16 with 20, but I want us to look at number 18 first, which also is about basketball. I've got my North Carolina water glass here. Well, it's a beer pint, but it contains water, not beer right now. This is a long quote from Dean Smith, who was the coach of the men's basketball team at North Carolina for many years and one of the most successful coaches in men's basketball. Coach Smith wrote the following: "If I were empowered to write the rules concerning college basketball eligibility, I wouldn't allow freshman eligibility for men's basketball or football. The recruited freshmen would play on freshman teams along with non-scholarship players. They would have no overnight trips to take them away from their studies. Their practice time would not be as long or as intensive, nor would they have to spend as much time talking to the media. It would give them a better chance to adjust to their academic load and to being away from home for the first time. Aren't teachers supposed to support what's best for their students? Freshman ineligibility would be in the best interests of the student-athlete. We don't do it because of money. Spin it any way you choose, but we allow freshman eligibility in men's basketball and football because of money. If colleges give a freshman a basketball scholarship, they want him, quote, earning his keep, unquote, on the court right away. It's wrong and short-sighted, but I've fought that battle for years. I know when I'm licked." Now, Coach Smith is doing two things in this passage. For the first half, plus a little bit, of the passage, he is giving an argument. He's trying to give reasons for believing that freshmen should be ineligible in college men's basketball and football. But after that argument, he switches gears to explanation, and that starts where he says, "We don't do it because of money, spin it any way you choose, but we allow freshman eligibility in men's basketball and football because of money. If colleges give a freshman a basketball scholarship, they want him earning his keep on the court right away." Because, we know, is a common premise introducer. However, when Coach Smith uses the word because, he's not using it in the context of an argument. He's not giving reasons to believe anything there. Instead, he's explaining what motivates the NCAA to allow freshman eligibility in those two sports. And I bring this up because it's important for us to keep in mind the difference between argument and explanation. Let me turn now to number 20, which, as I said, I will compare and contrast with 16 for you. The writer here says, "Many of my earliest memories of the 1930s involved the virulent anti-Semitism in the world at that time. I am not just speaking of what was happening in Hitler's Germany. I am speaking of what was very much happening here in America as well. I am Jewish, and my public schooling in Scranton, Pennsylvania was filled with anti-Semitic events. For example, in 4th grade, there was a kid who almost every day during recess would come up to me and call me kike, moneylender, Christ killer, and other prejudicial slurs. I would go over to him and call him Hitler, and we would start fighting with each other. The teachers always just told us to stop fighting. They did nothing about the anti-Semitism that they surely heard. I learned that I had to defend myself. Not many others were stepping forward to offer help." Now, like in number 16, in number 20, the writer is telling a story. Not fictional, but a true story. A story about his childhood. However, in the context of telling this story, there is one very brief argument at the very end, where he writes, "I learned that I had to defend myself. Not many others were stepping forward to offer help." Why are we supposed to believe that the author had to defend himself when he was a kid in school? Well, because not many others, and especially not the teachers, were stepping forward to help him. So most of this passage is not argumentation. However, the last sentence does contain an argument. And it's not unusual for a fairly long passage to be mostly non-argumentative material, but for there to be a short argument someplace or another in the passage. Maybe at the end, like in this example, maybe at the start, maybe someplace in the middle. So that's something you'll need to keep your eyes open for. I hope this has been helpful for you. Let me know if you have any questions, if there's anything I can help you with. Take care. So long for now.